They say the dead do not walk among us. But what if I told you one woman defied that truth? In the winter of 1913, a town buried her, sealed her in the earth, mourned her, and moved on. Yet weeks later, villagers whispered of her shadow at the edge of the woods. They spoke of pale hands pressing against glass panes at midnight, and of her voice, soft but unshakable, calling out to those who once swore they had heard her last breath. This isn't folklore. It's a story pulled from parish records, forgotten letters, and a diary the family begged never to surface. Tonight, you and I will open it together. Hi everyone. Welcome to my channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep. Because once it does, you'll never see death the same way again. The woman's name was Elise Hartmann, born to a German immigrant family in a Pennsylvania coal town. She was the kind of figure history erases with frightening ease. Quiet, unmarried, tending to her father's household after her mother's early death. When she fell ill in late November, the physician diagnosed pneumonia, but witnesses wrote in private notes that her decline was stranger than that. Long gaps in memory, eyes fixed on corners of the room, and moments when she muttered to unseen figures. Her final days, they say, were filled with silence. And then one scream so piercing that neighbors 3 houses away still spoke of it decades later. She was declared dead on December 3rd, 1913. The funeral was small, the coffin sealed in pine, the grave marked with nothing more than her initials. And yet, just 9 days later, a blacksmith's wife claimed Elise came to her door, barefoot in the snow, lips blue, eyes wild. When the townsfolk dug into her coffin, they found it empty. The records end there. The town never spoke of her again, and yet there are letters from the pastor that hint at a punished men never meant to touch daylight. What punishment? What secret could drive an entire community to silence? When the coffin was found empty, it should have been the beginning of an investigation. But what followed was not justice, it was silence, and silence can be more damning than any verdict. Elise Hartmann's name vanished from church announcements. Her grave was refilled with stone and soil, and the doctor who signed her death certificate abruptly resigned, leaving town under the pretense of illness. It is as though the town itself conspired to scrub her existence clean, as though the very memory of her was poisonous. But there are fragments that escaped the fire. In the county archives, tucked between unrelated property disputes, I found a letter written by a farmer named Joseph Rankin. He described the night he was awakened by someone, or something, knocking at his barn door. He opened it, lantern in hand, and saw Elise. Her skin, he wrote, was pale, like flour mixed with water, and her hair hung heavy with frost. She spoke no words, only raised her hand and pressed her fingers against his chest. Joseph swore her touch burned like coal fresh from the furnace. By the time he staggered back, she was gone. His letter ends with the words, "If she is in the earth, then it is not her walking. But if it is her walking, then who have we buried?" The handwriting stops abruptly there, and Joseph was later found hanging from a beam in the same barn. His death was ruled suicide, but locals whispered something darker. They claimed his body was discovered with his eyes open and his lips frozen in a scream, as though death itself had frightened him. The more you peel back, the more Elsa's story begins to look less like a single case of mistaken burial and more like a collective punishment, one the town refused to acknowledge. There are faint allusions to something unspeakable tied to her family, a child born and never registered, a debt owed and never paid, an act of betrayal no one wished to commit to paper. And every thread points back to Elise, the quiet daughter who was suddenly erased. Why would a town hide a truth so completely? And why would they bury someone twice, yet still not be rid of her? If Elise had remained a rumor, perhaps her name would have faded quietly, as the town clearly intended. But the most dangerous thing about the past is that it never truly stays buried. It festers, waiting for cracks to form. Those cracks came not through official records, but through the whispers of children, who are often the last to keep memories alive. In 1915, 2 years after Elise's supposed burial and disappearance, a schoolteacher wrote in her journal that several students refused to walk home at dusk. They claimed a woman in the snow followed them from the edge of the forest. She never moved when they looked directly at her, only when they turned away. The teacher dismissed it as childhood fancy, until one evening she herself saw a figure standing in the dim light beyond the schoolhouse fence. What unsettled her was that the figure was there, but that its head was slightly tilted, the way one stares at something they do not understand. The teacher described a detail that still chills me. The figure's dress was torn, but the fabric had not rotted. It was the same dress Elise had been buried in, gray wool with a single rip at the sleeve. She was certain of it. And then there were the church bells. In February of that year, at least 3 households reported hearing the bells toll at midnight, though no one was inside the church to ring them. The sound was said to be uneven, halting, as though struck by hands that did not quite know how to move. When the pastor was confronted, he insisted no one had access to the church at those hours. Yet parish logs show him writing only 3 words across the page for that week. She will not rest. Why? Why would a woman, silenced by death and stripped of her history, return to walk among those who wished her forgotten? Some locals believed it was a punishment from God for sins hidden too deeply. Others whispered Elise had been wronged in ways no burial could erase, that she had not been allowed to die in peace because she had never truly lived in truth. Whatever the reason, the sightings became fewer after 1916, but they never stopped. Even as late as the 1940s, there are accounts of an unmarried woman wandering fields alone, barefoot, her skin white against the night. The deeper one digs into Elise Hartmann's story, the more it begins to resemble not merely a haunting, but a cover-up threaded with guilt. When a community collectively chooses silence, it is often because the truth would unravel them, and in Elise's case, the threads of silence were stitched most tightly around her family. Her father, Wilhelm Hartmann, was a stonemason by trade, respected but feared for his temper. His records vanished from the census in 1914, just months after Elise's burial, though no death certificate exists. What we do have are fragments, unpaid debts, abandoned contracts, and a strange note scrawled in the corner of a ledger, reading only, "She knows." Scholars argue over what this means, but in the context of her reappearances, it suggests something Elise had carried, a secret that was never meant to leave the Hartmann household. Then there is her younger brother, Lucas. In 1917, he was institutionalized at Fairmount State Hospital. His intake form is chilling. Patient claims to see sister nightly, speaks to her as if alive. Patient insists she asks for warmth, but cannot be touched. Doctors dismissed his ramblings as psychosis, but his words echo the testimonies of townsfolk who swore they too had seen her, pale and watchful. One nurse at Fairmount later wrote that Lucas refused to sleep in a bed, instead lying on the bare floorboards, because, as he put it, that is where Elise waits. He died in confinement, age 28. Even more disturbing are fragments found in the church archives, a draft of a sermon never delivered. The pastor wrote, "The sins of the fathers are not buried with the daughters. When truth is locked away, the dead will not rest. We are all complicit." Why did he never preach those words? Why were they tucked away, left for dust to claim, as though the town itself demanded obedience to silence? The story of Elise begins to look less like the resurrection of one woman, and more like the slow bleeding out of a family's darkest inheritance. A punishment shared not just by blood, but by the entire community that chose to look away. And yet, even through the cracks of fear, Elise kept appearing, fragile, pale, insistent. By the 1920s, Elise Hartmann's name had nearly vanished from official records, but stories of her persisted like a fever in the shadows. The town never spoke of her openly, yet every family seemed to have its own whispered account. When survivors of that era were interviewed decades later, they all carried the same look in their eyes, a mixture of dread and recognition, as if mentioning Elise risked summoning her once more. One such testimony comes from a woman named Clara Hastings, who as a child lived near the Hartmann home. She recalled being sent to fetch water one winter evening. At the well, she saw a figure bent over, hair hanging low, fingers raw against the stone. Clara thought it was Elise's mother, but when the woman raised her head, the face was bloodless, the lips torn as though bitten through. Clara dropped her bucket and ran. The next morning, when her father returned to the well, he found the water frozen solid despite the temperature being too mild for ice. He swore the ice had formed around something pressed beneath the surface, something shaped like hands. And then there are the strange fires. Between 1922 and 1925, 3 barns, all belonging to families once close to the Hartmanns, burned to the ground. The causes were never proven, but each fire was preceded by reports of a pale woman standing near the property line. Survivors swore she was holding something, a scrap of cloth, a lantern, a shard of wood, that vanished when anyone drew near. The most chilling account, however, comes from a traveling priest who visited the parish in 1924. He kept a diary, not meant for public eyes, where he described being called to bless the Hartmann property. In his words, "The house is cold, though the hearth burns. A woman lingers in the hall, pale as frost, her dress in tatters, her mouth fixed open as if to cry, but no sound emerges. I raised the cross and she turned her eyes on me, not in rage, but in sorrow, deeper than any I have seen among the living." This moment changes the shape of Elise's legend. Perhaps she was not a monster returned from death, but a wound made flesh, walking, burning, freezing, reminding the town of what they tried to bury. As the decades moved forward, the town grew, industries shifted, and the Hartmann name nearly disappeared from public memory. Yet the absence of a name does not erase the presence of a shadow. Elise continued to surface, now less as a person and more as an omen, appearing at moments of tragedy, loss, or betrayal. Her figure became a kind of warning, one that only the cursed could see. In 1933, during the height of the Depression, a young miner named Albert Griggs reported seeing her at the entrance of the mine shaft. He described her standing barefoot on the coal dust, her eyes fixed on him with a look of sorrow so sharp it cut deeper than fear. Hours later, a collapse inside that very shaft killed 7 men. Griggs survived, though he never set foot in a mine again. In his later years, he told his grandchildren, "The dead girl doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. If she looks at you, it means you'll never be the same." Other records echo his testimony. A midwife in 1938 swore Elise appeared at the bedside of a young mother who died giving birth. In her statement, she wrote, "She was there before the breath left the girl, watching, waiting, her hand outstretched as if to take her across." This is where Elise's story bends into something more complex. Was she a curse lingering over her family's sins? Or had she become something else entirely? A guide, a witness to suffering, unable to leave the world until the truth of her death was spoken aloud. The chilling fact is that no such truth was ever confessed. No journal explains the scream that marked her final moments. No archive reveals what the townspeople meant when they whispered, "She knows." The silence is louder than any written word, suggesting that what Elise carried to her grave was too unbearable to commit to history. But silence does not erase pain. It transforms it, feeding it until it takes shape. And in Elise's case, that shape walked through the snow, lingered by wells, watched from churchyards, and followed children home from school. It was never laid to rest, because the truth was never spoken. By the 1940s, Elise Hartmann was no longer a person in memory, but a presence stitched into the town's folklore. The kind of story told only when the fire burned low and children were warned not to listen. Her appearances had grown rarer, but they carried a heavier weight, as though each sighting was both a curse and a confession. One of the last known encounters comes from a railway worker named Thomas Avery in 1946. Walking home after a late shift, he claimed a woman stood at the crossing, her face pale, her hair tangled in the wind. She raised her hand, and Thomas stopped in his tracks. A moment later, the train roared past, faster than scheduled, tearing through the darkness. Had he taken one more step, he would have been struck dead. He swore Elise had saved his life, though her expression was not one of mercy, but of grief, like someone forced to watch suffering without ever being able to prevent it. The final document that threads Elise's story together is a letter never sent, found in the church cellar during renovations in 1961. It was addressed only to those who remain. The handwriting is shaky, but the words are clear. We buried her, and in burying her, we buried our guilt. She was wronged, not by one hand, but by all. Her silence is ours, and until we confess, she will remain. The author is unknown, but many believe it was the last pastor who served during Elise's lifetime. It is here that Elise ceases to be merely a ghost story. She becomes a mirror. Every community has its buried truths, its unspoken sins that linger across generations. The question her story asks is simple, but terrifying. When silence becomes tradition, do the dead ever rest? Or do they keep walking, watching, waiting, until someone finally speaks the words that were forbidden? Elise Hartmann's footsteps may no longer echo through the snow. Her pale figure may no longer stand in the corners of schoolyards or barns, but her story remains. And perhaps that is worse, for stories never die. They wait